So, well, I'll just start this off. We want to talk a little bit about Western breeders, and all three of us have had different involvements with Western breeders. And myself, I was a producer at the time, so we drew all our bulls there. And at that time, it was mostly for private treaty use, and it was more of an insurance protection. And I'm talking a long time ago, probably Earl, back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so, and also they had AI schools there, and that's where I took my AI schooling with me and Gavin Hamilton. We were both pretty young guys then, and I think I learned how to do it, and he didn't. Don't tell him I said that.
Yeah,
But,
that's your story.
but anyway, it was a lot of fun because them schools were fun.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
There was a lot of guys there, and
Yeah.
of course you stayed at the old Crossroads Hotel and that
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah.
And probably that's where I met you, Earl. I don't know. That's a long time ago. So you were there many years. So
Yeah.
that's about all I got to tell you about Western Breeders. But they were a good outfit, I can tell you that. So.
I can give you a little bit of history, and then Earl but Doug Blair and Gordy Dallaire were both employees at BCAI Center, British Columbia Artificial Insemination Center, a cooperative AI deal in Milner, BC. And Gordy was the lab manager, and Doug was their sire analyst, was his title, I believe. And that, and anyway, they formed Western Breeders originally, purchased property at Balzac, Alberta, Canada, in 1967, and basically started business in 1968. And it was a custom collection businesses was the original, and this was just the start of the what we called the exotic boom, the Charlet we're in, and some of them at that time. So they were making deals. Then from there they transitioned into marketing, whatever, and they became Marriott. They were Western Breeders Limited, and then Western Breeders Services Limited, and that was the marketing arm. Western Breeders Cattle Company, in that they took either part or full ownership in some bulls, primarily importing some exotic bulls, Simmental, Maine Anjou, and some of them from Europe under that name. But through that transition, and Earl can probably fill you in better, Canadian Beef Sires was the formation, and really, from what I understand, was the forerunner of testing beef cattle for different traits, performance traits, and things like that. And they formed an alliance with Western Ontario Breeders, Eastern Ontario Breeders, and United Breeders in Guelph, Ontario, along with Western Breeders, to analyze these bulls. And so bulls of different breeds, semen was put out there in herds, and then they would buy the female offspring. Was it just the females they bought?
No, they bought
or bought them all, I think.
Yeah.
So at a bit of a premium, and then they were taken to facilities, actually at Erskine, and under the management, Canadian Beef Sires, of Bob Prestige.
Yeah.
And that kind of started genetic testing and whatever. And later years, they formed alliances and ownership, part ownership of New Breed Industries out of Manhattan, Kansas, and they became a good company for both. And then they did unique things as well. They established a bit of a syndicate in the Holstein deal, where they would get some Western Canadian breeders of Holstein cattle, and they would go and purchase a bull that they thought had the potential to really, do some good and whatever. And this would be a young, and they would utilize the herds in Western Canada to sample this bull and test it and whatever. And they had some great success, and it allowed some Canadian Western Holstein breeders to really become mainstream, if you will, and that. So, and then later, just to skip ahead, there was a transition when the downturn in the I'll say the exotic boom and whatever, and there was a readjustment happening, and actually I worked for a couple of years for them through that deal, but Earl had the
Yeah, well,
history.
again, my name's Earl Scott, and I was kind of raised in that Balzac area, and so I kind of watched Western breeders, start up, and there was, as John said, there was Gordy Dallaire and Doug Blair, and but a local farmer put up the land, Earl James, and that was his contribution, and then another Albertan, Rodney James, became involved as well. So actually, with the day it started, there was four of them in on it, and so they had Western Breeders Limited, and some of the other companies that they developed afterwards only involved Gordy and Doug, or other people from the outside came in as well, as far as Ontario Association of Animal Breeders to help them. But the real need, or the reason for them starting, was at the time of the what we would call the exotic boom of cattle in Canada, the importation of cattle from Europe. And so because up until that time there was really very little to no AI in beef cattle. It was very limited. But with the exotic boom and these cattle coming in from Europe, mainly bulls, people wanted to try this new breed, but the only real way to do it was through artificial insemination, and that was the main startup for that AI center. And at that time there was hardly there was no AI centers. At one time there was one at Olds, and I think Vermilion actually collected some bulls at one time, but those were at the colleges. But once this exotic boom took off, it really boosted the livestock AI business in Canada as general. But anyways, it was the importation of those cattle that got that going, and then it just grew from there. So yes, I went to work for them in about 1973 and spent 30 years working for Western Breeders, which then turned into another company, Alta Genetics, and from there I also contracted with them for 10 years after that. But the company is still in operation today under the name of Alta Genetics, and it's bought other companies since. It's likely one, if not the largest artificial insemination company in the world, and they do a lot of different things now. Of course, a lot of new technologies come down the road, and so they're leaders in it. It's owned by a gentleman in the Netherlands now that was actually a very close and personal friend of Doug Blair, who started the company. So it's, I don't know, I just like looking back on it and see, how it's been developed and progressed over time, and it's, still in operation. Yeah. So
it's quite, I guess, whether neat's the right word or not, but what it was started for. I mean, it was recognized so early on what the need was, and to be able to take that opportunity and have the foresight and the enthusiasm and the wherefore-all for those two. Well, like you say, there was four really involved in Western Breeders Limited ownership, so that's certainly, the James boys is referred to, and that, helped aid the growth of that. But the vision that Doug and Gordy had, and then the reputation that they built for Western Breeders to be a very reputable, worldwide respected business in the cattle industry, and the uniqueness of some of the things, the royalty program. So if I got an import permit for a European of different breeds bull, and I bring them over and whatever, and what was my expertise would be, some breeders in marketing and whatever. So yeah, if I had the ability, you could take it to Western Breeders and they would custom collect the semen, they would store the semen, they would distribute the semen, or you could enter into a royalty program with them where they would facilitate all of that, and every vial of semen that was sold, you got a little bit of it, dependent, and some a very successful deal. And their distribution, and Earl will tell you better, but the amount, they ran truck runs, and Earl and I both, we were involved in redoing them at the end, or that. But unbelievable the reach that they had and how it advanced the Canadian beef sector. To me, they were one of the key reasons that our beef sector rose and developed to the degree that it did, in the speed that it did. And both in exotic, but also the Angus and the Herefords and all the rest, Shorthorns and whatever, we all benefited from Western breeders.
Well, more people, because of that kind of exotic boom, more people in the beef industry accepted artificial insemination and started to see what it could do, whether, you know, whatever breed it was. If you got a good sire and you could market them out there and expand the base of them, where before, I mean, a bull in a herd was closed. I mean, breeding 20 or 30 cows a year, it was very limited, but the expansion of artificial insemination and what it's done for genetic improvement, it's likely one of the biggest things in cattle breeding in general in the world, I would say. So.
And I think Earl too, and John, both you, the amount of people that have gone on to be very successful in the beef industry and dairy industry that we know, that worked there. I mean, we could sit here and name for quite a while
People that went through there.
but there was some pretty key people that have gone on. One guy that sticks to my mind is Steve Dorn. I mean, he's gone on to be a top-notch, if not the top auctioneer in North America. You guys know probably more than
Well,
that. But
Steve and I worked at the same time there, and Earl was there as well. But I still chuckle. One of the great names in our beef industry of the time was a photographer, Walt Barney.
Walt worked there?
No, he didn't work there, but he was there numerous times. There all the time, and the one time that for a little while it was like, okay, Steve, you get these bulls ready. John, you bring them out and hold them, and the rest of you guys get the hell out of here.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
You know, and Steve went on to be, oh my God, you'd drive with him in a pickup truck or whatever, and he'd be practicing. This was before he was really the auctioneer, and that, and would sometimes kind of drive you nuts. But there's been a huge number. And as they expanded, they also opened White City, Saskatchewan, which was to allow people from the Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and whatever, just more access, and that to bring their bulls in and get them custom collected and that type of thing. And AI schools were run there. Grant Ralston was also become a photographer. He worked there at that time, and I think Grant and I actually helped at a couple of the AI schools. You know, we were the gophers, chase the cows in and catch them and whatever, and then we got to do the AI school for nothing.
Well, I figured one day there, I think I trained about 1,000 people in AI.
Did you?
Really?
Yeah. You weren't the teacher I had. It was Jerry Bowes.
I didn't start teaching till in the about the 80s, and I know I did it for 10 years, and I was doing schools all the way from Alberta right through to Manitoba, and I would do 5-6 schools a winter at least, and you know, you'd have 25-30 students at least in a school, and it trained a lot of people.
And another thing about that, Earl, too, was guys like me that were taken to school, we'd all buy an AI kit and an AI tank, and I mean, they did a lot of business out of it. It was big time.
Sure.
It was, you know, it's like buying your stamps at the co-op.
Once you trained them, you sold them to them that day, and
probably sold them half a
and then they had
bucket of semen.
And then they kept coming back buying semen and nitrogen and
bringing their bulls back.
And bringing their bulls.
I thought it was great.
They set up a delivery service of trucks going on a schedule. They'd come through every 6 weeks, and stop at small towns, and you printed a schedule and you mailed it out. And so if you were in, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, you knew on this day at this time the truck's going to be parked in front of the co-op station downtown, and you'd pull in there, and sometimes there was 2 people, or if you were up in Rosthern, Saskatchewan, there'd be 32 people show up. So you had to adjust your schedule for whatever. So
Sometimes you're at Carrot River trying to get there in the gumbo and the mud. And the next time you were in Cadillac,
River.
Saskatchewan, where the Gophers and
it was quite a deal.
Prestige and Bo's got a few stories about that one.
Oh yeah.
They ran the truck. They didn't go
Yeah.
by miles either.